Uh, I don't have a mouse though. Oh, got it. Okay, perfect. All right. So my name's Lindsay. I am one of the college counselors with C2 Education. We have locations throughout Fairfield County, including Ridgefield, which would be the closest to here. Tonight, we're going to be talking about all of the factors that go into college admissions. And this is kind of a special COVID edition. So it'll also look at what has happened because of COVID, what things may linger after COVID. So we have a good idea of what things will look like. And in order to do that, we're really going to look at this through the lens of what does a day in the life of an admissions officer actually look like? Because that factor can play a big role in terms of what acceptances actually look like. It is still a very human process at the end of the day. So in general, if we're talking about a highly selective top school, they are looking at more than 40,000 applications, and they have 15 to 20 weeks to review them. That basically means each application is 15 pages, 500 pages equals 2 inches, 200 feet of paper, 20 floors if you stacked all the applications on top of each other, if they were still paper applications. So it is, at the end of the day, needing to literally stand out from a crowd. And that process starts very early when we start to think about the things that go into admissions. So this is actually 2019. It does say last year's, but this is a 2019 look. This is an Ivy League school. These are real metrics for what that would look like, but we're going to use them as we're kind of walking through some examples. So you can see admission rates at many of the Ivies are not only below 10%, they are now below 5%. The biggest factor that COVID has brought is, with some changes and loosening of some requirements, that now means that that application number is going through the roof. And different types of students, different types of people, they may have a different outlook in terms of schools. But you can still see, of applicants, perfect GPAs, over 8,000 of them. Perfect math SAT scores, over 3,400. Perfect reading and writing scores, over 2,700. Most of them are in the top 2% of their class. Unweighted GPAs are almost perfect. Average SAT score 1512, average ACT 34, average number of APs is 8. So if you think you want to be competitive at top schools, this is realistically what the numbers look like. Admissions teams end up going through a lengthy process. Essentially, it starts by sorting into their geographic regions. Usually each region has 4 to 6 people who are reviewing. They read and review the applications. They submit applicants to subcommittees, and then those who move from subcommittee go to the full committee. Then you get your decision. So it is not a case where just one set of eyes is looking at your application, but that can be both a blessing and a curse, because you might have one person who's 100% behind you. You may have one person that sees something different and another that sees something else different. So it's not a guarantee just because your numbers are perfect that you're in. It's not a guarantee just because your essay is awesome that you're in. We'll look at what each step of the process looks like. So reviewing student applications, tonight we're basically going to let you decide. We'll be looking at 2 applicants as we talk through each aspect of admissions. You'll look at what their application looks like, and at the end, you'll decide who's getting in and who isn't. The top factors in admissions decisions pre and post-COVID are school performance, standardized testing, always 1 and 2. They are the number 1 and 2 things that have always been looked at. But with COVID, don't we have the option not to test? At many schools you do. However, what you need to think about, if it's 1 and 2, and you take one of those things away, now you have only one thing to be looked at with. Test scores should be something that make you look stronger and supplement a strong school performance. As you're looking at your application, you want to think about it like a bouquet of flowers. Do you want a really big, beautiful bouquet of flowers with lots of different flowers that complement each other? Or do you want one bouquet of just one kind of flower? That can make a big difference, especially at top schools where everyone looks pretty good. Everyone's accomplished. So when we talk about school performance, we always need some context. Our two students are going to be John and Michelle. That's who we're deciding between. GPA on its own is not enough. We have to know, what does a 4.0 actually mean? And by that, we need to know more about the school. Something that people don't realize is that when you apply to college, your guidance counselor provides the school with a profile that tells them how you compare to other students and how you compare to what you could have done in high school. So a 4.53 on its own does not necessarily mean that he's a better student than Michelle, because we don't have enough information. GPAs can be unweighted or weighted, which means if you are in top classes, if you are in a lot of APs and your GPA is weighted, that 4.5, probably out of a 5.0. A 3.75, that might be unweighted and out of a 4.0, which means if we unweighted his GPA, they might be the same. When we look at a student's school performance, we want to look at how good are their grades relative to how good they could be. How hard are their classes relative to how hard could they be? Now, if we were in rural Kentucky and we didn't have any AP classes and we didn't have access to a lot of advanced classes, we wouldn't expect a student to have that. That's not the case here. So we're usually expecting students to have very rigorous classes. Most schools in Connecticut do not rank anymore. That's okay. Doesn't matter if they do. But they want to see how hard are your classes, how hard have they gotten over 4 years, and how good are your grades? Yes?
So how do you decide whether the class is hard or not? How do you measure the hardness?
So you want to look at whether or not the class is college prep, which means that's your standard level, honors or AP. Yeah. AP classes are your most rigorous classes. So that is what we look at in terms of difficulty. But we also look at things like electives versus core classes. Do you stick with your foreign language for 4 years, or did you get out after 2? Are you taking English for honors, or are you taking electives? Those things can play a role. IBs are a different type of program compared to APs. The only school in Connecticut that offers that is in Norwalk. So it's just a special type of class. So when we are looking at John and Michelle, with that added context, you can see there's a little bit of a difference. John attends a high-performing school. 96% of students from the previous years have gone to four-year colleges. Michelle also attends a high-performing school. 98% of her previous year students went to four-year colleges. Students at John's school can take 15 honors classes, 19 APs. Obviously, they can't take all of them, but they have that many options. Michelle's school can also take 14 and 13 respectively. The next piece is where it gets important. The highest GPA earned in John's graduating class is a 4.89. The highest in Michelle's is a 3.97. So her 3.75 looks a lot different put in that context. Most likely her school does unweighted GPAs. Most likely John's, in theory, could get up to a 5. Your guidance counselor provides this information to colleges so that they understand what your options are. Now, because this is the COVID edition, there are some exceptions now that you may want to articulate on your application if you are applying in the next 2 to 3 years. If your grades, ability to take an AP exam, or anything related to the lockdown hurt your academic performance. Now, that doesn't mean we can just say every bad grade is because of COVID, but there are some realities of teachers who left mid-year, classes that weren't offered, schools that were closed, the gaps in terms of how quickly we went online. all of that may be relevant, at least for the next 3 years. All right, so now we get a little more context. John has a weighted GPA. He is ranked 5 out of 106. Michelle has an unweighted GPA, and she has a 3.75. She is also in the top 10% of her class. So right now, both very strong students. This is very typical of what they see at the Ivy level. Everyone has great grades. Everybody has hard classes. Everyone's coming from top schools. It's very hard to compete on grades alone, but the grades are still what is opening the door. When we start looking at the rigor aspect, this is where we want to see how hard are his classes. So you could see John's program is considered the most demanding. He has 11 honors and 8 APs across all of the years. So is Michelle's. She has 9 honors and 8 APs. Out of what was offered, John could have taken 15 honors and 19 APs. She could have taken 14 and 13. At the bottom, you can also see which AP classes they took. And there are some things that are relevant here because both of them are taking calculus. John is taking the slightly easier version of calculus, what's called calculus AB. She's taking calculus BC. So from a rigor standpoint, even though they have the exact same number of APs, in a way, Michelle's is a little more competitive because she has that additional BC. Some things we want to look at too when we're helping students plan is what majors are we thinking, what direction, because that might change the classes you choose to take. As I mentioned, lots of APs, good grades in their APs, so they're very competitive students. So when we start looking at standardized testing, SAT and ACT scores are an easy way for colleges to compare students who go to different schools. That's why they're standardized. Because you can see from a class standpoint, everything can be different based on how schools rank, how schools grade, that can look different. That's why SAT and ACT scores can play such a big role in admissions. They're easily compared, and colleges do not favor either test over the other. So you should do whichever test is best. Our 2 kids, they did the SAT. So the SAT is back to being out of 1600. So if you had children or yourself who went through the process a few years back, you might remember it was out of 2400 for a while, it's back to 1600. Both the SAT and ACT are content-driven tests, which means you can learn them. Gone are the days of analogies, gone are the days of all the tips and tricks. There's some test taking strategy that comes into play, but the majority of it is, do you know the math? Do you know grammar? Do you know how to read effectively? Skills that transfer directly to college. If you choose not to submit test scores because a school is test optional, then you have to think of how you will compare with that piece out of the puzzle. For me, if you think you want an Ivy, there is no optional. There's no optional to any part of the application process, definitely not standardized tests. If you are looking at lower tier schools, it's really going to come down to, does the test make you look stronger or weaker compared to other students who are applying? That was true before COVID as well. We have essentially 3 different types of schools. Test required, you have to submit test scores no matter what. Test optional, you can submit them if you want to, but you do not have to. And test blind. Test blind means you cannot submit them. Right now, the schools that are most notably test blind are University of California schools. We don't know what that's going to mean for them multiple years out. There is some talk that they want to develop their own test. So there may ultimately be a test in that regard. We just don't know yet. That was a COVID-based decision. Most schools fall into either required or optional. Even if a school is optional, you may be locked out of certain financial aid or certain opportunities if you do not submit test scores. They are very transparent about that. So in the event that you are applying to a school and it says test optional, just make sure it's not required for any specific things. To give you an example, I had a student who was going to the University of Alabama. To get a certain scholarship, he had to get a certain SAT score and he had to submit it. He could get in without it, he couldn't get the scholarship. So those are things that you have to look at case by case. But in our instance of John and Michelle, they both have SATs. Each section is out of 800. So we've got a 1480 and a 1470. So both are very strong students. Only thing of note, John is a little more evenly matched. His reading, writing, and math are very close. Michelle has a little more distance, but some of it depends on what are they planning to study. If John is planning to study law, then he looks pretty good. He's going to go history, he's going to go philosophy. If Michelle is planning to do math science, she's looking pretty good because her math is stronger. So even though their composites are the same, there is more to be gleaned from their scores. So just to recap these two factors, school performance, number one, always has been, even more so post-COVID. Standardized test performance comes next. It's genuinely a good thing to have, unless you have a specific test taking issue. Again, if you really struggle with testing, if you have some learning differences, it may be a larger conversation. But if you can submit test scores that make you look strong, that's the way you generally want to go. That said, the admissions process is holistic. That means that they do not only look at what did you get on your tests, what did you get for your grades. They look at your essays, they look at your recommendations, extracurriculars, any demonstrations of academic passion, like if you do a summer program or you do something else outside of school, an online class, those types of things, and demonstrated interest, which we'll talk a little bit more about shortly. But these are the factors that come into play. Nobody's going to write you a recommendation where it's not pretty nice about you. If that's the case, your teacher should say no. I get a lot of questions about what are the better extracurriculars. Is it better to have a lot of service? Is it better to have work experience? At the end of the day, it kind of doesn't matter. We want students to look well-angled as opposed to well-rounded. Yeah.
So if, let's say there's a student, the applicant has a very strong music background, so that would be that's considered good for extracurriculars?
Yep, so what we want to think about is how do they use that to give themselves some different angles? So maybe they're playing an orchestra in school, maybe they're playing in an outside orchestra, maybe they're teaching music to underprivileged kids, maybe they are teaching music to younger students, maybe they are doing programs outside of Connecticut. There's a lot of ways that music can be your passion and be the thing that's a highlight of your application while still showing different sides to yourself. You want to think about how is your time being accounted for? The way it shows on your applications, they ask you for up to 10 activities, what it was, what you did, how many years of high school you did it for, and how many hours per week. And the one that kills a lot of students is the hours per week. So if you're someone who's competitive in piano and you're competing in it and you're doing 20 to 30 hours a week, that accounts for your time. If you're doing 2 hours of piano and nothing else, that's a concern. Yeah.
So let's say there's a student who's had like 2 hours of violin class per week, or let's say 4 hours of violin class. So the time that the student puts in is the class time, the duration of the class time, or is it like including the practices that they put in?
You could most likely include your practices, the amount of time you're using. But if you're doing 4 hours of kind of structured piano or structured violin, I would expect you to have some other activities. Now, maybe there are other music activities, maybe there are other clubs, maybe it's volunteering, but you would want to have more than just violin in that case. So here we're going to get into it a little bit more. We're going to look at our two students. Anything outside of academics that you do outside of normal classroom, that is considered an extracurricular. So school, sports, clubs, activities, volunteering, internships, or jobs. So you can see in this case, John has 4, 3, and 1. Michelle has 3, 2, and 2. But as I said, the number of extracurriculars is not as important as the time and the passion you are putting into it. Now that can also mean how much of a leadership role are you able to take on? So if you're running track, maybe that means you end up captain of the track team. If you're in a club that you're very passionate about, maybe you have an officer role by junior and senior year. If you are volunteering, it should show some type of increased responsibility. So the number itself is not as important as the time and the depth of what you're doing. So superficial stuff is the hardest to sell. I have a lot of students, especially my mid-range students, who are like, well, last summer, I volunteered for 2 hours a week for like 3 weeks. Great, that doesn't look good. That just looks like you knew your applications were coming up. So you said, I'm going to do some volunteering. You want to make sure it highlights your passion in terms of what you're doing. Passion is demonstrated by the amount of time and the quality of time. So those are the two biggest factors. If you are president of a club that you never have to actually go to, not as good as if you're president of a club where you can demonstrate regular meetings, initiatives you've developed, things that you've been inspired to do in that position. So it's important to think about time and quality, not just the quantity of things you're doing. Quantity is not always best, especially if you're not able to excel in any of them. So now we're going to get a little more detailed. So John's activities, he's captain of the tennis team, he's in stock market club, he's in ski club, he's editor of the art magazine, she's in jazz ensemble, captain of debate, editor-in-chief of the newspaper. Volunteering, we can see that John has a few things he's done here and there. Usually each summer he does some amount. On the flip side, Michelle volunteers every Saturday and every Sunday. John shadowed a local doctor. Again, Michelle every Saturday volunteers at a local hospital. I would give Michelle the edge when we're looking at extracurriculars because of the depth of what she's doing. Yes, she still has about the same number of activities or slightly fewer, but there's a consistency to them and a depth to them. And all of her activities she has been doing for the full 4 years of high school. When we look at her sports clubs and activities, her volunteering kicks into gear where you expect it to, and her work presumably started when she was able to work. John's a little more scattered. Some things he's only been doing for 2 years, some things he only does as one-offs. He was in ski club, then he was out. But because this is the COVID edition, there are some caveats. Now, in a normal year, in a pre-COVID world, Michelle's got the edge. Where John could make up some ground, it's very possible that some of his activities were suspended because of COVID. Why didn't you go skiing in 10th grade? Maybe there was no skiing. Why did you only do 1 week of Habitat for Humanity? Maybe you were only able to because of COVID. There is a place on applications, and we expect it to stay for the next few years, where you can explicitly state how COVID-19 impacted you. That's a lot of what it looks at. Because frankly, if this was a post-COVID world, captain of the tennis team probably wouldn't mean too much because they didn't play last year. Captain of debate probably wouldn't mean too much because I didn't debate last year. So there is a place for that right now. Any student who's currently in high school should be able to explain that stuff. Yes.
So what is like a good time to start? Which year should students start applying for colleges or looking at colleges or doing college visits?
So you'll start applying. You don't apply until you're a senior. It's fall of senior year.
Fall of senior
Yep. But we're going to talk a little bit about demonstrating interest It's a good idea to start thinking about and building your list by the end of sophomore year. The reason being, when we talk about demonstrating interest, which we'll look a little more at, that's how you engage with the schools that you're interested in. They have no idea who you are. That makes it harder. So you need to show them that you have interest. So recommendation letters, colleges will request recommendation letters from their guidance counselor plus 1 to 2 teachers. Again, the letter should provide more context. Most recommenders will ask for a brag sheet. That is where you kind of put down all the stuff that's great about you. Again, nobody is going to write a letter that says you're a terrible student. They will just tell you they won't do it if that's the case. But you also want to think about like who's going to write a good letter versus just write a generic letter. The more info you give them, the better. Guidance counselor recommendations include a student evaluation and that profile we were talking about the high school. So that's going to tell the school not just, hey, the kid is a good kid who's a hard worker who's going to do well, but here's how they compare to everybody else. That's automatic. Again, your guidance counselor can't drag you in the evaluation. They wouldn't do it if that's the case. Teacher recommendations, you typically want to use someone who currently had you as a student. So if you are a senior applying to college, you're typically looking at a teacher you had junior year. If you've had this teacher more than once, that can also be an asset. But you want the recommendation to be unique, specific, and positive. That's where having a brag sheet can help, because if the teacher doesn't know you well, that's how they know what to say. But if you've built good relationships, and this is why thinking about who you're going to have and what classes you're going to take and when you're going to take them, that can all impact your recommendations.
When you talk about high school profiles, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how do you compare high schools from different states?
So they will literally give them a breakdown of every class that you can take, how they grade, how students in the school typically do. So that, for example, is like how it said John could have the highest student in his class has a 4.8. Something like that would be sent.
So I look at like the US News rankings or the grade school rankings that we see sometimes. Is that one of the factors? Does that contribute to like comparing profiles of schools?
So the national rankings of high schools usually has to do with college placement and things like standardized testing and standardized test scores, not necessarily with what students are doing individually. They're not just going to say, without looking at data, oh, you're at the #1, high school in the country. But if you're at the #1 high school in the country, your profile is going to be very strong. So they want to see how you are relative to that profile. So for example, if you go to like an elite prep school, the school profile is going to show that you had a tremendous amount of opportunity. They want to see if you took advantage of it. Just going to the school is not enough. But the flip side to that is there are schools that do not have what we have here, and they need to know that when they're assessing students. Same for some of the more inner city areas around here. It makes a difference if your school just does not have the offerings or if students at your school do not perform as well. Okay, so when we're looking at recommendations, you could take a second to read these, but you can see that they're all pretty nice. They're not knocking me out of the park, but he sounds like a good kid. He sounds like he's balancing things. I can tell that he clearly told them to make sure they mention he's an athlete. So maybe he's trying to get recruited because multiple of them mention that. Third one is the most generic and the one that gives me the most pause. It's probably the guidance counselor. Michelle's are a little more effusive. It looks like her teachers probably know her a little bit better because they're very specific, they're detailed, and they put a little more praise in there. But again, the third one is not great. But you can see that she has told her teachers and her counselor what she wants to be highlighted. She wants to make sure they know she wants to be a doctor. She's clearly told them that. So from the school's perspective, oh, this is something she's talked about. They talk about challenging herself. They talk about her not fitting a stereotypical role. Medical gets mentioned again, along with her other activities. So not drastically different, but looking at these, my guess would be Michelle has a better relationship with her teachers. That doesn't mean John's a bad kid by any means, just that his letters are more generic. Additional demonstrations of academic passion mean that outside of your standardized testing, you're able to show that you are academically minded. Again, this might be something like taking a lot of APs. It might be something like looking at college classes over the summer. The one thing that is no longer available is SAT subject tests. That used to be a big way of showing that you were standing out from the crowd. They got rid of them. Business decision, the College Board would rather you take AP exams than take subject tests. For us in this area, it doesn't concern me too much because we have a wide range of APs. It's something that definitely hurts, to my mind, people who can't take APs, or it puts a lot of pressure on them to take them. So advanced placement exams are our biggest factor now. AP exam scores are different from your class grade. You typically take them in May. Some of them have trickled into June because of COVID, but we do not know that that's going to be the case now because they have not said yet. They usually wait till January, February to make any changes. What we want to see is that I got an A in my class. I got a 5 on the exam. I am an excellent student and my class was really hard. One thing that parents will still frequently say to me, well, isn't it better to get a C in an AP class than to get an A in a regular class? It's better to get an A in an AP class. That's kind of the honest answer, because if you're getting a C, the story that sends is that you are not ready to do that kind of work. If you're getting an A, you are ready for college more practically than some of your other students. The exam score proves that your teacher wasn't easy. Because if you get an A in your class, but you bomb the exam, that probably says that the class was not that hard, or the students in your class were not as rigorous as you are. Question?
No, I was just thinking, so that means when they do the AP exam, the AP exam in May or June, that is also a test for the teacher. Like, how good the teacher?
It can be, but the school is not going to have that information. Okay. So it's ultimately on the student to prepare. Most AP exams take about 8 to 12 weeks outside of school to plan for. Now, because this is the COVID edition, when we think about how COVID has impacted AP classes, there's 2 big factors. One, every time school has to close, every time they have a half day, every time school gets canceled for whatever reason, they get behind. The AP exam still covers the same amount of work, whether your teacher got to it or not. That is definitely a larger issue because of COVID, but we've had it even when it just snows a lot. If we don't physically get into school, they get behind. I can usually tell with AP US history, wherever you are in January, I can tell if you're on track or not, because I can just tell from where you are. That means you have to be prepared to get ahead of your class if need be. The exams also, because of COVID, had some form changes over the last 2 years. If you took an exam during the lockdown, they changed it from a 3-hour test to a 1-question test. Not surprisingly, a whole bunch of people got better scores, because if you happen to get a question you're very good at, you're going to do better. Last year, they went back to the normal format. However, some students did not take their tests until June, which gave some students almost a month longer to study. Whether that really helped is up for question, because most of the students who took it in June did so because their schools had had more closures. So can't say for sure that they got more out of it. Some schools did them on paper, which has always been how AP exams are done. Last year, they gave the option of online. Anecdotally, my students who took it online did worse compared to my students who took it on paper. So that's all stuff that, again, if you are in that pool of students, you will have a place on your application to discuss it, but it's something that moving forward needs to be planned for. So you can ignore where it says SAT Math 2. That was a subject test. Those do not exist anymore. AP exams are scored out of 5. So John has 2. He has a 4 and a 4. Michelle has 2, a 5 and a 5. We do not typically report on applications exams that are under a 4. So if you get a 3, 2, or a 1, we don't usually bother saying so. The national average on most of them is a 2. So getting a 4 or a 5 takes a good amount of work, but they're not stupid. They know if you're not reporting a score and you took a class, you probably didn't get a 5. Those scores are self-reported, so it's up to you if you tell them. Demonstrated interest. This is the one that people know the least about, which is how are you showing the school that you want to go there? The more selective the school, the more important this is. At the end of the day, college admissions counselors are trying to choose people who are going to say yes to them, because that's what their job is. Their job is to fill the class with the best possible people. So they want to make sure the students they're accepting are super interested and super engaged with the school. Many colleges track the activities of students who are potentially applying. So you can see here, this form says email and tour. That shows that John emailed the school and toured the school. Michelle shows that she went to a day shadowing a student. She emailed twice. She did a junior advisory day for prospective juniors. She's done a campus tour. She sent a thank you letter. You want to make sure you're checking all those boxes. Yeah.
So the email and then shadowing the student, right, in the potential college that you want to apply to, when does that typically happen? Like,
talking to the school can happen as early as freshman year. Okay. I had a student who knew she wanted Columbia. That's all I heard about for 4 years. And she literally was on a first name basis with the Connecticut admissions person, because she used to go down to guidance every time they came to visit. She used to shake their hand. If they were doing a local event, she went. She was emailing them all the time. Earlier is better than later. Tours, emails, all of that stuff can happen early. Things like shadowing tends to happen later, closer to junior, end of junior, beginning of senior year, because that's usually who they offer it to. Same with stuff like interviewing. Some schools just don't interview anymore because they don't have the bandwidth to do it. But you should ask if you can interview, and if you can, you should do it. Ivies tend not to care as much because they just don't have time, but it's a good way for you to show, I want to interview, regardless of the outcome of the interview. That happens closer to senior year. So they should be asking questions about the school, asking questions about programs, asking questions about how they can come visit, asking questions about things like shadowing, all of that. And it should come directly from the student, not from a parent. They can now also engage on social media, like Instagram posts, follow them on Facebook, all of that kind of stuff.
What did you say TY was?
TY is a thank you letter. So after you did your tour, after you visited, you sent a thank you letter. So all of that helps to show that you're interested in the school. Remember, the students that we're talking about, if we look at John and Michelle just numerically, they're both awesome. So this kind of stuff, as silly as it can seem, can make a difference when two people are so evenly matched. College application essays. This is a big one. Most schools now use what's called the Common App. That means all of your schools are on one application. You just have to fill out your contact information once. You just have to put your activities once. Then you have one big essay. We usually just refer to it as the Common App essay. It used to be called the character statement or personal statement, where you are going to get a chance to tell them more about you. The most important thing is it should not be a resume dump. I don't want to hear about the 10,000 things you've done. I want to hear one story that tells me something about you that I can't get out of the rest of your application. I should already know you're an EMT, so don't tell me you're an EMT unless something crazy happened when you were an EMT. Give you my favorite example ever, best essay I ever read. This was a student who was in the Ivy Factor. She was applying to them. She told a story, 650 words, about the first time she visited India as a 6-year-old. And it was the first time she wore traditional clothes, and they're held up by a knot. And because she was 6, she said, I'm going to tie as many knots as possible, which was great until she had to go to the bathroom. And oh, excellent. The whole essay was about her figuring out how to untie the knot. And as silly and sweet as that story is, it tells me a whole lot about her. She's first generation. Her family's from India. She has a deep tie to her roots. She's been visiting since she was 6. She's a problem solver. She has a sense of humor, all from that silly, simple story. So they don't have to be about changing the world. I once had a parent sit in front of me and tell me that they were wondering if I thought they should go to Africa for the summer to get an essay topic. I said, absolutely not. That's silly. But they don't have to be stories that are crazy. They have to be personal, and they have to tell us a lot. I'm working on one right now with a student where she comes from a Jewish family. She's writing about the first time they celebrated Rosh Hashanah after her grandmother died, and how she decided to be the one to make the apple pie. And again, tells me a ton about her with a pretty simple story about making a pie. So that is the best way to do it. They should be narrative stories. So there can be dialogue, there can be characters, for lack of a better word. We'll look a little bit at what some of these examples look like. They're a little bit of a wall of text. So you can see John starts with like pull over. I explain motioning frantically. I'm going to pet a cow. So see, again, simple stories. They don't have to be about changing the world or something that drastically changed you. They need to be about something that's meaningful and something that will be remembered. So you could, yeah, there's a couple slides here, but they can be up to 650. And you can see her very similar. It's a story about running for the bus, figuring out problems with her hair, her appearance. What you do want to be a little bit careful of with these essays is you don't know what biases a reader might have. So things that are very political should be avoided unless you know it's something that's important to the school. Anything that could be offensive, however unintentionally, you want to be mindful of. Now, I had a student, she felt really strongly about writing about something on race, and we talked through kind of what some of the pitfalls could be. And she told me, you know what, I don't want to go to a school that wouldn't think this is a great essay. So it's fine. She's got to go into it with a slightly different mindset, but she understood what the risk was. Now, that doesn't mean everything has to be super generic and happy, but you do want to think about, am I bringing something to the table that my reader, even if the school is super progressive and liberal and loves what I'm saying, the reader is a human being. What are they going to take away from it? All right. So holistic admissions, the number one factor are those essays. Then it's going to be recommendations, extracurriculars, demonstrating passion, demonstrating interest, everything else that you do. There's no magic number. Every year I have a student come in and say, do I need 10 activities or 15? There is no magic number to it. It's the depth of what you do. This is the stuff that has to be planned for starting at the end of middle school. Because if you want to take AP classes, you can't just take them because you want to. You need to be on track for them. If you are not entering high school in at least geometry, you are going to be behind in math. Those are all the factors that you have to start planning for. Same with extracurriculars. You're not just going to learn the piano as a junior. So if you are interested in those things, you have to start thinking, what am I going to do in 9th grade? I have a student right now. She's my favorite because she totally gets that. She's in 8th grade. She took her brother's high school catalog and she's already like, I'm going to take this elective as a junior. I'm going to take this class as a senior. And I'm like, good, keep thinking that. Think about the clubs you're going to do. Think about what you want to do. Because if you're not set up to do that, you can't just decide to do it senior year. You have to be ready for it going in as a freshman.
So all of this is in addition to the course grades.
Correct.
And the SAT.
Yep. Right. So academics is the first thing they look at, and still the most important thing, whether you go test optional or not. All the other stuff is the stuff they look at next. So typically the way I think about it is, if they're putting you in the maybe stack, maybe means all the numbers are good or decent. Now we're going to take that maybe stack and say, these ones have a great essay. These ones have great extracurriculars. These ones have great this. And that's how we're going to make our decision. So a great essay on its own, I always have to break this to a student every year or two. Great essay on its own is not going to do it. You got to have the grades. You got to have everything else going in. But good grades plus a great essay can help to make the difference. Many schools will also still have supplemental essays. Those are questions that are specific to the school. So why do you want to go to our school? Why do you want to major in this? So you have a few more opportunities as well. All right, it's time to decide. Who are we going for, John or Michelle? Yep, absolutely. I would probably go Michelle too. Now, again, we're humans. I've done the same presentation and had people be like, John, it's John. So admissions folks are human too. There's no magic key to it. The numbers on their own don't tell the story, but everything else starts to. And we can definitely help with that. We do everything: college admissions counseling, grade support, SAT, ACT, everything that goes into it. I've left some stuff at the back if you want to grab anything. If I was going to grab anything, I'd go for this. This looks at each year of high school and what you should do. So that can definitely help you plan out. Again, our closest location is Ridgefield. We also have a really big online presence now, thanks to COVID. So if you need anything, we're happy to help. Okay. Absolutely, you can connect with us. We also do have centers down in Atlanta. I believe that's the closest, but we can always do it virtually. Our virtual platform is pretty much the exact same thing we do in person, just with screens instead.
So what are the things that you have like in terms of the application?
Yep, so we do everything, starting with if you need help picking your classes, if you need help with your grades, if you need help with your SATs, if you need help with your essays, if you need help with your applications, you need your college list. Usually we start by doing a consultation where we just kind of go through everything, and then we can build a plan together. Any other questions?